Today on Rappler, despite controversies, Davao City Mayor Rudy Duterte still has an 11-point lead over the next candidate for president in the latest survey. Administration vet Leni Robredo overtakes Senator Bongbong Marcos in the vice presidential race. And in the province of Bataan, a congressional candidate is poised to become the first transgender lawmaker in the Philippines. Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. We come to you live from the Rappler News Center. This is your top of the hour update in the run-up to the 2016 Philippine elections. Davao City Mayor Rudy Duterte is still the voters' top choice for president despite the controversy surrounding him. The latest ABS-CBN survey conducted by Pulse Asia shows Duterte with 33%. The survey covers the time he was accused of not declaring an alleged multi-billion peso bank account. Administration standard bearer Mar Rojas climbs 2 points to overtake Grace Poe at 22%. Poe drops 1 point at 21%. Vice President Jejomar Binay dips 1 point to 17%, while Senator Miriam Defensor Santiago has 2%. In the vice presidential race, Rojas' running mate Leni Robredo climbs 4 points to 30% to overtake former frontrunner Senator Bongbong Marcos, who's now at 28%. Senator Chis Escudero gets 18%, while Senator Alan Cayetano 15%. Senators Gringo Anasan and Antonio Trillanes have 3% and 2% respectively. Still on the ABS-CBN survey by Pulse Asia, Senate President Frank Drilon still leads the senatorial race. He used to share the top spot with fellow re-electionist Tito Soto. Drilon enjoys an overall voter preference of 47.8%, while Soto has 43.5%. Coming up next are Kiko Pangilinan at 41.9%, Mig Zubiri 38.9%, and Ping Lacson at 38.5%. A week to go, less than a week to go before Filipinos go to the polls, President Benigno Aquino ramps up the campaign for his bets and hits their closest rival, frontrunner Rudy Duterte. Aquino singles out Duterte, who said he'd close down Congress if it impeaches him. Aquino points out, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the president can abolish Congress. Aquino says, in his words, the way he speaks is different, but is that enough? He also refers to the country's maritime dispute against China, saying, quote, if we need allies and you greet them rudely, how many will be on our side? Our enemy over the South China Sea is a powerhouse. The Aquino administration has a pending case before the United Nations-backed arbitral tribunal, but Duterte is in favor of bilateral talks with China. Critics also hit Duterte for his supposed lack of knowledge regarding economic policy. A congressional candidate is poised to become the first transgender lawmaker in the Philippines in Bataan. Geraldine Roman is running in the 1st District of Bataan. The odds of her winning are high, coming from a well-entrenched political family in the province. She wants to succeed her mother, Herminia, who served a maximum of 3 terms. She speaks 3 European languages, holds 2 master's degrees, and worked in Spain as a senior editor of the Spanish news agency before returning 4 years ago to care for her father. She speaks 3 European languages. We're going through. Her possible victory will mark a breakthrough for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender or LGBT community. In other news, Singaporean officials arrest 8 Bangladeshi men for an alleged terror plot. Singapore's Ministry of Home Affairs says the men are members of a group called Islamic State in Bangladesh. 31-year-old Rahman Mizanur set up the group in March. That group plans to recruit more Bangladeshis in Singapore. Officials also seize money intended to buy weapons for Bangladesh attacks. And that's the top of the hour update. I'm Maria Ressa. Now, joining us are Lisandro Claudio Leloy and Joel Canuday, the research associates from the Ateneo de Manila University's Institute of Philippine Culture. They're part of a team who put together a study about the vote of the poor, which is the majority of the votes in the Philippines. Tell us what you found, Leloy, about Filipino voters today.
Well, the first thing we found out was that they care mostly about the principled stances of politicians. They don't really care too much about things like platform. They care if the politician is principled and if the politician cares about the poor.
And did anything surprise you when you were talking to them?
I think one of the honesty of most of the people that we've talked to. By the way, our study covers the more impoverished segment of the country, and we did realize from our study that there appears to be an acceptance of the difficulty that the country is going through. That there's more of a reflection that's going on in the country today that is not pretty much being discussed in the public space. So we call this study the vote of the poor, and it appears that the vote of the poor is more of a reflective voters than we imagine.
More reflective voters than you would think.
So this is the second time we've done this study. We did this study first in 2004, and basically what we're trying to communicate is that the vote of the poor is a thinking vote. It's very common these days to say that poor voters are uneducated,
yes,
there's such a
correct.
thing as a bobotante,
right.
or that they just sell their votes because they don't have principles.
Right.
But we found out that they actually think about things. They think about the candidates, they think about maybe not policy the way quote-unquote educated people think about policy, but they think about what politicians do. And they think about what they do with their votes. So for instance, we did in the initial phase of our research concerned vote buying, we found out that people know what they're getting into when they're selling their votes, and that they think about that in a reflective way that has moral, intellectual, and political considerations.
What does that mean?
That vote selling is not just an immoral act. So if you look at a lot of sort of voter education right now, they say, when you sell your vote, it's like you're selling your soul, you're selling your rights. But the poor don't think about it that way. They think about it in a more complex way than that. So for instance, some poor believe that when they accept money from politicians, that they are rightfully accepting that money because that money belongs to them.
Will they vote the way the politician wants them to vote?
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the point we're trying to make here is that is a reasoned process. That is not simply an immoral process or something that a bobotante does.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a logic in accepting money or in selling the votes. Among the logic that we have found out from our studies, that this idea that at one level, the vote buying is being considered as a gift. At another level, they also consider this as something that is earned from untransactional relations, that they entered into a contract or a gentleman's contract, and that they're just delivering what they have delivered. Another aspect that we have seen is that this belief that this money is theirs and it rightfully belongs to them because they don't get the right services anyway coming from the government in non-election days.
Or that some services are in fact taken away from them. So for instance, in one barangay in Quezon City, we were talking to someone and we said, why do you accept money from politicians? Person says, oh, we accept money from politicians because the system takes away money from us all the time. Look at what I just did now. I bought something overpriced from the sari-sari store because of VAT. So this is just like my rebate.
Isn't that called rationalization?
It is quite logical.
It is.
Yes.
So there's a logic to what seems to be an illogical engagement in elections.
Got it.
And this is, I think, where we'd have to think about how we do voters' education. This is not, majority of our voters probably are not looking at something ideal, something
they accept that it isn't ideal.
Yeah, it isn't ideal, and they know that it isn't ideal, and that's probably where voters' education should take a hard look, because much of the education that we're doing are all premised on what is ideal, the ideal candidates. It's not about the examination of the problems in the community.
What's the percentage of the population, of the voters' population, do you consider poor?
So the way we defined it was, well, first we did, we partnered with SWS, so we considered DNE, what they consider DNE to be poor.
Is
So
that
was...
Is that about 65% of the vote or larger?
Was about something...
we didn't really look into how big it is.
but it was the that does cover the majority, especially like D is the largest segment, I think,
Correct.
in SWS.
The census would say.
Yeah, the census would say.
Okay.
And but so that covered breadth, but in terms of depth, we covered 4 communities. And these communities reflect different aspects of poverty. So one community was in Quezon City, and that's urban poor.
Okay.
And we did a rural poor community in Camarines Sur, rural poor.
Got it.
And then we also went to a conflict area, which is Zamboanga, the site of the
Yes.
Zamboanga siege. So that's
Yeah.
conflict poor. And then finally we had a community in Tacloban, so a kind of disaster poor.
Yeah.
So these are various ways to which our countrymen are experiencing poverty.
And what did you find? Urban poor, rural poor, conflict areas, and disaster prone areas.
Essentially, there's a different reasoning on voting per se, or on as well as on the question of vote buying.
Okay.
Among the urban poor, Quezon City and Zamboanga, I think there's a strong sentiment that they do know that vote buying is as a moral issue, as a moral problem, but they do it anyway. Among the rural poor, there's more of a shall we say ambivalence onto it. Not so much of a more concrete idea that this is right or wrong.
I guess a
they know
little
it's right or wrong, but there's an ambivalence.
Yeah, and a little bit less cynical about the process, I guess. So
in the rural.
we were interviewing someone in Camarines Sur, and they said, and we asked them, do you accept this money? And they said, yeah, we accept this money, but we consider this money as gadan na kwarta, patay na pera, dead money. Meaning it's kind of dirty money,
Right.
which I will not use to feed my family. So I will accept this money, but it's too dirty to use for feeding my family. So we said, what will you use it for? I said, dead money is used for dead things like gambling and
Entertainment.
and
gosh.
entertainment.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
That's so
Yeah.
interesting. Can I ask you though, given this, Lelo, you mentioned initially principles and how they care for poverty.
Yeah,
for poor people.
malasakit, yeah.
Right, so-
Malasakit for poor people.
So given this, and again, from the outside, it looks like ways of rationalizing something that is considered wrong. Let's say, I'll throw that in, right? So how do you define principles?
So when we ask the question, I mean, it's a survey, so it's
Yeah,
just said
yeah.
principio. So and
I see.
they rank that number one. But we can of course kind of examine how they think about principles when we start doing the interviews on the ground in these 4 communities.
Right.
And I think principle largely means kind of consistency for people. So one of the reasons why, say, corruption charges matter is because most politicians claim that they have integrity, and a lot of politicians these days claim that they're poor or that they came from the poor,
Right.
and that they understand the poor. And a corruption charge throws a monkey wrench at that perception of the politician, and the poor see that contradiction, and as such base their conclusions on that contradiction.
In the conflict area, while they do see corruption as an issue, I think the greater concern there, in terms of understanding what is a principal leader, is the leader that could bring about peace, that could
Got
end the
it.
conflict, that could stop the war. So that trumps all the other issues that matter. So if you're a leader who have the solution, or at least the perception, who may have the solution to the problems of war and peace, then that would be considered as a principal leader.
What we're trying to find out now, Maria, in personal interest of mine, is whether or not care for the poor means that the person, if it matters if the person was once poor,
poor.
himself.
Right.
Because this is a major claim of many of our politicians. And for this election cycle, you have Jojo Binay and
Right.
Rodi Duterte making that claim.
Right.
So we want to validate if that really works. We
This-
don't know yet.
What you've found so far, does it explain the dramatic rise of Rudy Duterte?
Yeah. I can speak of the Zamboanga area where I did a bit of an immersion. What I'm seeing here is that some voters may be seeing that the periphery had been, the margins had been left out in the national discourse, the political discourse, in the socio-economic discourse.
Yes.
And I think they see in Rudy Duterte is probably the embodiment of the periphery finally moving forward.
Lelo, were you surprised?
So for us, actually, our urban poor community likes Rodi Duterte, but our rural poor community does not like him.
Interesting.
And so my suspicion, and so we started hypothesizing about this, but of course we have to validate it. But my hypothesis is that density matters. So in an urban poor community where it's very dense, somebody who says, I'll get rid of the criminals, I mean, that's appealing because you know there's a criminal 2 doors away from you. Whereas the whereas crime is just not as pressing in a rural poor community. And what we found actually is that in rural poor communities, they don't like someone who isn't magalang. So galang is still quite important in a rural poor community, like the rural poor community we were studying in Camarines Sur.
Can I ask you to extrapolate to what values? What are the values? Do these reflect some of the values? Are there differences in values between urban poor and rural poor? Can we extrapolate?
So far, this is, I have to preface this with saying that it's very provisional, the information very provisional. But at this point, like, yeah, I think, you know, when Rodi Duterte curses our respondents in the urban poor area, they really object to it. And those objections are not as pronounced in the urban poor areas.
So the rural poor objects to the cursing.
They object to the cursing.
They're more traditional values.
Traditional values, and you know, would you call that conservative, or would you call that a concern for galang and respect, or in smooth interpersonal relations? I don't know, but definitely they don't like the cursing.
It's different in the urban area, and it's different as well on what experience they went through in life. Conflict areas, that's not so much of an issue. Urban poor areas, pagiging magalang is not so much of an issue.
So given what you've found so far, and I guess in the context of these surveys that we've had, right, what do you see the Filipino voter going for now?
For me, the rise of Rodi Duterte is kind of, in a way, it's explainable through previous phenomenon like the rise of Erap Estrada or the rise of global populism.
Yes.
But in certain respects, actually, it's sui generis. It's not something we've seen before in Philippine politics, and I don't think survey data is going to completely explain this phenomenon.
It's dramatic, right?
Yeah,
it's
it's
a
dramatic,
very dramatic rise. Do you have any insights, your thoughts on how and why?
Populism could be possibly one. And I'm going back to my previous points. Just for so long a time, politics, national discourse is pretty much centered in the capital.
They feel
here
left
comes
out.
there's an embodiment of someone else who's bringing the discourse from out of the capital into the center. That's probably where this populism is coming from.
Yeah, I kind of think that there are two major blocks of Rodi Duterte supporters, and they're probably mutually unintelligible, mutually opaque to each other. There's one, you know, the big Manila NCR ABC Duterte supporter, and the other one is the Mindanao support. So Mindanao support, I think that's explained largely by what Joel explained. But the Metro Manila ABC, I mean, that's a different phenomenon in itself, and there have been many theories as to why Duterte appeals to them. Dean Julay Tihanki of LaSalle said that this is actually the disgruntled middle class. They don't have, there's nothing for them because the poor have the CCT, the very rich have the growing markets. What's in it for this disgruntled middle class? I find Dean Tihanki's argument quite persuasive, actually.
And I'll push you forward in terms of what else is different about these elections. Do you see social media playing any significant role?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Our survey, the survey that we partnered with SWS, it would show that television still marks the highest in terms of access to information, and in fact across the board, ABCDE. It's television news, in fact, not just television. Not television talk show program.
We asked them what sources of media do you trust the most, and it's television news number one.
Number one. Social media ranks 10%. In the survey, but what is also, if you look at dig through the numbers, there's also a difference between the way the different regions would appreciate the source of information. In Metro Manila, I think the access to information through television news is about 80-86%. That's quite high. In Mindanao, it's about 68, nearly 70%. So there's also a grade, as you can see in that access to information. But certainly, it's the TV news that is more influential in terms of the thinking or the access to information. But we all share access to information.
But what these surveys, of course, don't reveal is how much these media interact with each other.
Yeah.
So how much does the buzz, for example, in social media inform what is happening in television? We can't account for that. But I suspect that if you take these things into consideration, that social media matters a lot more than the 10% that was revealed in the SWS survey.
49% of the voters are between the ages of 18 and 34 years old. Anything demographically? I mean, in terms of the youth, do you see them veering in any direction?
Um, we didn't dig into the
Yeah.
ages.
And this is more vote of the poor than vote of
Yeah.
the youth.
Vote on the ages.
But Lelo,
Yeah.
you've been watching. I guess you're also on social media, right?
Yeah.
Does the youth vote affected by what they see, what they share, what they read, and the campaigns on social media?
I think, like, for example, there are many things that people once considered youth issues or youth non-issues. So, for example, Marcos historical revisionism. A lot of people thought that was a problem of millennials. So you had these preachy baby boomers telling the youth, "Oh, you don't know your history, you don't read your history." And then the surveys come out, and the people voting for Marcos are actually people who lived through the period themselves. So there are many things about the youth we're finding out in this election that are surprising for me and that are quite exciting for me, actually.
Anything surprise you, Joe?
Yeah, about the youth. There might be a regional breakdown on how the youth may engage and may interact. It is the same as well with the entirety of the population. What we're seeing is that we don't have a homogeneous voters who thinks in one way or the same. What we're probably seeing now is that they might be siding onto one candidate at the moment, at this present time, a week before the election, and we're at it. A week after the election, there might be another sentiment that you would find out, and the survey seems to be showing that for quite some time there seems to be a fickleness on where and who would the voters settle. So it's a fluid ground across the line, across the board.
But based on the SWS survey, the youth, like everyone else, they're looking primarily for principled politicians.
Interesting. And again, the definition of that would be what?
The definition of that, the survey can't cover it because
Okay.
it's just that item. But for us, I think what's emerging is really a politician who kind of sticks to his guns, is consistent about certain issues, and that does not contradict himself or herself.
To pull together the social media and Duterte authenticity, I mean, even the fact that he refused to,
absolutely,
right?
yeah.
I mean, these are some of the things. Vote of the poor. When you decided to do this study, what were you looking for?
This is a study that piggybacks on a 2004 study. There was a previous study
Yes,
that
correct.
went into it. Initially, we thought that we could see a different trend, but we didn't actually see another dimension in it. What we saw is a more a nuanced dimension of that aspect of voting pattern, which is among the poor, that they really think through, they reason through how they vote. And what we didn't expect much this time around is how open they are in talking about vote buying, and how revealing their sentiments about vote buying and vote selling.
And other machinations of politicians, to be frank. So we have people who are talking to us about being flying voters,
Yes.
or being illegally registered voters.
So this is actually a much more open, more transparent, in a strange way. People seem to feel, at least from what we see. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, because there's a sense that they're like, everybody knows this is happening.
Correct.
So what's the use? Yeah, what's the use of not talking about it?
let's talk about the vice presidential race.
Okay.
Lenny Robredo, Marcos,
Yeah.
Bongbong Marcos, fighting it out for the top spot. Lenny ahead just a little bit. She seems to fit what you're saying.
Yeah.
Explain.
She's a bit more predictable based on the data, right? Because
Yeah.
the data says they're looking for someone who has principles and they're looking for someone who has malasakit. And this is your archetypal image of a mother na may malasakit. Whereas it's easy for the anti-Marcos, for the people who campaign anti-Marcos to portray Marcos as having that contradiction, the contradiction of having of claiming to have principles, but at the same time having a lot of money. That's what they did to Jojo Binay also, and I think that explains the precipitous decline of Jojo Binay as vice president. So that, based on the data, is a bit more easy to explain than Rodi Duterte.
and probably the sympathy is also riding on to the cattails Lenny's husband for that matter.
Right,
And people are seeing through that. As we're saying, we have the same information in terms of the news, and people knows about the background, the backstory of each of the candidates.
Interesting. So what you were saying about Rudy Duterte, interestingly, if you actually go with the principles, it sounds like they're looking for unity of identity.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
we
that
think
would be the
yeah.
principles, and then the pro-poor, he also fits that.
Yeah.
What an interesting. The rise of Marcos, what explains that?
Well, I think part of it is connected to the rise of Duterte, namely the desire for a kind of order. I mean, what we should have done in this survey, actually, in retrospect, was to place in that list what are you looking for in a candidate.
Correct.
We should have put there somebody who provides order.
Yes.
And my suspicion is that if we had placed that in that survey, that might have ranked quite highly. Yeah, especially for middle class voters who are, well, I mean, they're middle class, so they have nothing to complain about economically. So they're looking for, I guess, like a sense that things work.
Yes.
And order would therefore rank highly there. But we didn't expect this in this election, so we weren't able to place that item in the survey.
I also think that the Marcoses remains popular in many segments of the Philippine population. I do remember when I was yet a reporter, when Marcos comes in a local area, some people would shriek with admiration. We're seeing Marcos, we're seeing Bongbong. So there's that admiration, even towards Aimee Marcos. There's still that admiration. I think he's also riding into that popularity that their family had built during martial law.
And this is just a theory. But if you think about when martial law happened, 1972, that was 30 years after the inauguration of formal democracy in the Philippines, roughly 30 years,
Yes.
1946. And now it's roughly 30 years after the re-inauguration of Philippine democracy in 1986. So maybe, Philippine history can work in terms of 30-year cycles where you kind of play around with electoral democracy or freewheeling democracy for 30 years, and then people find it inefficient and they clamor for something stronger. But this is just a pet theory I've been peddling.
Well, you also, I'll move a little bit away from the Vote for the Poor study, and let's move towards machinery, political machinery, from the realities of the vote buying, right? Do you think machinery will work this time around, these elections?
Machinery always counts in every election. It never fails. But it's just that if someone else is much ahead, probably that would affect the balance that the machinery can provide. Well, the test of the pudding is in the eating. We won't really know until election comes how machinery would work this time. But it would appear that the Duterte camp has less machinery compared to others. But then that would change because, as we already know, in the midnight before the elections, loyalty switch.
That's where the Johnny-come-latelys come in.
That is a big machinery that could be gas.
Yeah, no, I agree with Joel, except and this, I'm just observing this, but there is Duterte machinery. I actually don't buy this idea that this is a kind of completely spontaneous campaign and that there's no machinery there. I mean, just look around you. It seems quite organized. And I mean, this is a guy known for being an organizer.
Yes.
So you don't expect him to run a completely disorganized campaign without machinery.
Well, we've certainly seen the messaging on social media, extremely strong. If you look even on our feed, guys, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them on the Facebook page on our feed. Ang daming Dukay 2016. Sorry, Joel, you were saying.
I was just thinking, it might be good to look at the beginnings of the Duterte attempt towards campaigning. I think he started with federalism. And he toured around the country. And I think the idea of federalism may not exactly resonate. We don't know because there's no survey we conducted about that. What is probably resonating is the message that something is wrong with the system.
Yes.
Yeah.
With the political, social, and economic system. Duterte is bringing federalism into the conversation, but my hunch is that what the people are hearing is that the system is broken, we have to change it.
Yeah.
Federalism or not.
And
that's probably where it's coming from, why we are seeing a sudden rise.
And there is one thing that does match our survey. Our survey says that talk of platform doesn't really matter. So when the Makati Business Club accuses Duterte of not having economic policy, no, they don't care. That's not what voters are looking for.
Right. Right. Let's talk about the things that are different in these elections, right? We talked a little bit about social media, the youth, and then the effectivity of the old systems. I guess in your mind, I'd love to hear what you think is different and how you think it'll impact results come election day.
Oh, my facetious answer is that, of course, the Duterte phenomenon was created by Abaya and the traffic situation. But yeah, that's partly it. The ABC. But one of the things that I actually want to see in these surveys is to disaggregate A, B, and C, because we don't know yet. And my suspicion is that there might be something interesting in the C demographic. And this might actually be the demographic that is comfortable enough, but is in a kind of precarious enough position to want a little bit more order in their lives. And I suspect that it is that middle class that is really buoying up the Duterte phenomenon. And if the surveys would disaggregate that, my hunch is that we'll see that.
Joel?
These are I'm sharing Lelo's thoughts here. These are the people who are caught in traffic every day, or who are caught in an airport that doesn't really function quite well, who are caught in the problems of the lack of efficient services, and that's probably one of the critical mass that we are seeing, and it's being shared by the DNE, as well as some of those in the upper echelon, in the upper income bracket. Those are the things that is steering probably the discourse, the discussion on political elections at the moment.
Yeah, and I think what I forgot to mention is that this election really goes to show that all politics in the Philippines are local politics. So just look at these people. You have Duterte, who's a mayor. You have Binay, who built his reputation as a mayor. You had Mar Rojas, who had a chip on his shoulder for not being able to become DILG secretary immediately, and worked very hard to establish himself as a local politician towards the latter half of the Aquino administration. And you have Leni Robredo, who's also a very local candidate who built her reputation and on the reputation of the Robredo family being the family that built Naga up. So I think people are looking for people who have shown experience and credibility running local politics.
Interesting. Let me change the lens slightly and let's look at it at a global. Duterte has been called the Trump of the Philippines. You know, we're seeing some similar types of anger in the U.S. elections, and the marginalized coming together, moving around Trump. People who feel like they're not getting enough from the system as is. Fragmentation of narratives. Again, these are things I throw out. I guess. Please tell me. Do you see what pulls all of these strands together?
Some people blow this up and say, "Oh, we are in Weimar Germany." The period before the rise of Hitler and the rise of Mussolini, because you have all these populists who want to be authoritarian. I don't think the situation is that. The first thing I want to say is that I don't think the situation is that bad. But I think these global crises have created lots of insecurities. It's pronounced in Europe, for example, where everybody's afraid of immigrants and are therefore electing potential right-wing dictators or demagogues, and you see that also in the U.S. The Philippines was not too poorly hit by these crises. So based on that, I can't. On the one hand, I see why it fits within the global trend. On the other hand, I don't see how it fits within the global trend because there were no massive foreclosures here. We don't have lots of immigrants who are perceived to be stealing our jobs. So the situation is disanalogous from the situation in Europe and America, and yet you do see the rise of populism here nonetheless. But then maybe it's an older tradition actually. My sense is that the populist streak in the Philippines comes from the first person who claimed to be of the poor, for the poor, by the poor, which was Ramon Magsaysay. It's a very old tradition in the Philippines.
Joel?
First off, I think putting Duterte and Trump together, I think it's like comparing orange and apple on this case. For the level of, shall we say, issues that they're considering. Trump, anti-Muslim, Duterte is very much pro-Muslim. In fact, he's being embraced, and he gets a lot of support from the Muslim segment of our society. So there's no comparison at that end. There might be more comparison than what Leloy was saying. The populism magsaysay populism. That's, I think, where it is resonating, rather than comparing it with global trends. This is one of the local, shall we say, special element of Philippine elections. How to communicate to the public, to the masses.
Yes.
And magsaysay perfected that. And almost every other candidate, election after elections, are trying to emulate that. Some are doing it better than the others.
Yeah, it sets the template. So
Yes.
2010, you had Manny Villar, and he claimed, nakatulog ka na ba sa dagat ng basura? In the early manifestation of that in this election was Jojo Binay. And now you have Duterte, who combines that tradition with a call for law and order.
Wonderful. So one of the ways that we were looking at it was that fragmentation of narratives. I mean, you've seen the Imagine President series that we had there.
Yeah.
So one of the things, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, is that technology has empowered everyone and at the same time pushed change at a far faster pace. And that has led to greater fear of more marginalization, that you don't get any of the benefits of the change. Certainly in the US, that seems to be the case, right? The here in the Philippines, the trickle-down effect doesn't move down. Do you see this, or you disagree with it?
Possibly. I've always thought about the Philippines as exhibiting very similar voting patterns to the American South.
Oh.
So this is like, the Philippines in many ways like a red state, like an American red state. It's very angry.
Yeah, yeah.
It's conservative when it comes to
Yeah.
sexual values. And it tends to elect people who are folksy. And that's classic American South. And so insofar, if those anxieties are magnified by technology in the American South, and therefore they're likely to elect someone angry, that happens to us too. Anger gets magnified as well.
And anger gets magnified far more now
So
online.
technology is probably not changing anything. It's not changing the social and political landscape. It's just that it's more obvious. It's easy to see that because there are more media that we can. There are more lenses that we can look into.
Plus, they have a voice.
Yeah, and the voice.
You
as
have
well.
a voice.
There's feedback
right,
mechanism.
Right. So let's go back. Let's end with the vote of the poor. I guess. What do you want people to take away from this? What lessons can we learn?
I'll go back to my earlier point on voters' education.
Yeah.
There's probably many other aspects of the way that we communicate the messages of how it is to elect or to select a candidate than what we are doing now. But the other thing that I'm seeing here is that we're probably every election we have this discussion.
Yeah.
It's the same discussion over and over again and again. But for one, our political discourse was not built on party platforms. We don't even have a real ideological parties.
Yeah.
In Europe, they elect in accordance to manifesto, not in accordance to who's leading. It's part of the factor, but at the bottom line is what programs are you initiating? And that is not backed up by one candidate, it's backed up by the entire organization, by a party. We don't have that. And I think we're not really discussing that in the public sphere. And that's probably why we keep on discussing this election again after election after election.
I want to balance two things. On the one hand, there's complete populism saying the poor and the electorate, they're always correct. We should just listen to them. On the other hand, there's the other extreme of saying, well, the voters are dumb, we should just educate them. And therefore, the high and mighty should come up with lesson plans and preach to all these dummies out there. I think what we should do is combine those two things.
Right.
Recognize that the poor vote is a thinking vote, but also recognize that in terms of educating voters, we have some way to go. And if you find that non-patronizing middle ground that acknowledges that the poor thing, but at the same time knows that, acknowledges that there is a need for voter education across the board, not just with the poor, then I think we've found a kind of democratic middle ground there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for spending time with us. We were speaking with Leloy Claudio and Joel Canuday, part of the team who put together the Vote of the Poor. I'm Maria Ressa. Join us again at 8 p.m. We'll be live with headlines in a few minutes. See you soon.